Hello, everyone. It is November 15th, 2025. It is the weekend here in Raleigh, North Carolina, but we need to talk about something that's happening in one of our cities here in the state. Sadly, ICE is in Charlotte, as many of you have probably seen the news. ICE is basically acting as the enforcement arm of Donald Trump. We've all seen the terrible videos and the terrible atrocities they have committed in cities like Chicago, Illinois, and LA, California. I do not stand for this. I think that ICE not only needs to be disbanded and replaced, but this cannot continue to keep going like this. All right. ICE is spreading fear across the nation, and they are now trying to bully the city of Charlotte. And I encourage people to speak out, use their voices, and protest. But also at the same time, I want to be careful and make it abundantly clear that I want everyone to stay safe. All right. It is extremely scary to see what ICE has been doing across the country. So, from the bottom of my heart, if you go protest on the street, which you have every right to do so, if you decide to speak out against ICE, or if you're just trying to help your neighbor during this hard time where ICE is in one of North Carolina's cities, please, please stay safe. All right. We're going to go into just some basic tips here in a moment about how to safely protest. Again, never resort to violence, always do so peacefully. And again, I will say this a million times because it is extremely important. Please stay safe. So yeah, we're going to talk about some tips about protesting. We're going to talk a bit more about what my thoughts are on what should be done about ICE if I'm elected to Congress, and if we one day get enough votes to hold ICE accountable for their atrocities that they're committing across the state. I'm going to go ahead and pivot to this. I need to call out other Democratic Party leaders in this state who, as of 2:44 p.m. on November 15th, 2025, ICE has basically announced its presence in Charlotte, for lack of a better term, for about a day, maybe a day and a half now. Deborah Ross and Jeff Jackson in particular have not said a single word about this situation. All right. I'm obviously running against Deborah Ross, and if she wants to lead a major city like Raleigh, it should be extremely scary to see what ICE is now doing in Charlotte and to see what they have done in cities like Chicago. So, Deborah, please, this is not a joke. We need to prepare for ICE in case they show up in one of the cities here in District 2 or anywhere else across the state of North Carolina. Because I'm sure a lot of people thought that this would just stay in a state like Illinois or California because that's what Trump always targets. No, because Trump is acting as an autocrat and he is chaos. He wants people to be scared across the whole country. So if it can happen to Charlotte, it can frankly happen anywhere. All right. We need to stand up against ICE. And I'm looking at our incumbent who has not said anything as of the recording of this video. I've checked her website. I've checked her social media. I will not back down on this. We need to take a stand against what ICE is doing. All right. Alma Adams, who represents the city of Charlotte in Congress, she has put out a statement, but as many people especially in her comment sections have astutely pointed out, the only real action she mentioned was record everything. I'll touch on that in a moment because I do agree with that. But other than that, she hardly said any words. She hardly said anything about what specifically she is going to do. And she had some conflicting language about, ICE versus local law enforcement. But as we saw in the city of Chicago, local law enforcement did not do a lot to stop some of the things that were happening there. So this is an extremely dangerous situation, and Alma Adams needs to do more. She just flat out needs to do more. All right. And then lastly, I know some Democrats really may not like to hear this because he's well liked. Quite frankly, on one hand, I like him too, but his role is too important in all this to just not be called out. But Attorney General Jeff Jackson, again, as of Saturday, while ICE is in Charlotte as we speak, has not spoken a single word about this. I think the Attorney General needs to play a role in not just trying to stop these illegal operations of ICE in our state, but also in investigating their tactics, their scare tactics, their abuses of power, and things of that nature. I'm going to talk a bit more about that at the end of this video, but Attorney General Jackson, please try to get ahead of this because this is affecting our state now. ICE is terrorizing American citizens in this state as we speak. We need you to take action. All right. So, need to get that out of the way. But let's first start. Give me 1 second. Let's start with both just what I think a goal needs to be as this let's call it dispute with ICE is unfolding in Charlotte. A goal needs to be to de-escalate the situation. And that's why at the beginning of the video, I emphasized, please stay safe. Please do not do anything violent. Please use your right for free speech, for free peaceful protest, and to help your community during this hard time. And I will put this link in the description so you can examine it more yourself if you're planning to protest in Charlotte. But it really just comes down to some very basic but very much needed, tips to help de-escalate the situation. Starting with things like remaining calm, easier said than done, changing the setting. So maybe you're protesting in one area, try to move away from it and just keep your distance to keep yourself safe and others safe around you. Make sure to listen not just to those around you, but to everything that's going on, and try to respect some personal space. All right. We've seen a lot of videos, for example, where people get right up into the face of these ICE agents, and typically, regardless of what exactly was said, those people sadly end up getting detained. So a better way to just frankly help prevent that is, making sure your body language is open, dare I say, keeping your hands in a place where everyone can see them so they know you're not a threat, but also keeping distance away so that no one feels like their space is being intruded upon. All right. So just small steps like that. And also trying to emphasize, if you're going to go protest, they have genuine concern and willingness to help, listen and talk about what's going on, as opposed to just effectively screaming and yelling the whole time. And this DHHS document actually gives some good examples, really focusing on some of the verbal pieces of communication and some of the pieces of body language that can help if you're going to speak out against ICE, changing your tone, volume, your rate of speech, and things like that. So, for example, instead of saying things like calm down, you could say things like, I can see that you're upset, or, what can I do to help de-escalate the situation? Or may I speak with you about what's going on here? I know to some that might sound very generic, but the point of mentioning these things is that, again, you keep yourself safe, you stay nonviolent during all of this, but also keep your distance while still investigating what is going on. Remember, as you're saying these things, and as ICE is doing these terrible things in the city of Charlotte, you can record them, keep your distance, make sure your body language is open, and make sure you're doing the things to just keep yourself safe. So again, I will share those in the description. A couple things is also just don't go alone. Make sure you're with someone that can look after you and vice versa. Make sure that other people in your social circle know where you are if you're going to go protest. That way, God forbid, if something does happen to you, then at least you have the support network you need for your own safety, and just making sure that someone can, know where you are at all times is really important. All right. I believe they call it Apple AirTags on iPhone. I use Android, but whatever it is and whomever it is that needs to know where you are, if you're recording videos of ICE, if you're protesting ICE, or just speaking out, make sure that other people know your whereabouts, so that you have that going for you. Another thing that might sound very strange, but is still worth mentioning, sometimes when these people are on edge, whether it's the National Guard, ICE, or other military and law enforcement groups around the country, and this might sound a bit odd, but sometimes if you, again, keep your distance, if you show that you're not a threat, and you show some amount of kindness, then you can de-escalate a situation. So just to give a specific example about that, maybe you believe in the idea that America should have some sort of immigration policy, but what ICE is doing is clearly not it, which frankly is my stance. We'll get into that in a moment. But you could even say something, if you're in the city of Charlotte, along the lines of, hey, I respect the need for immigration reform in this country, but I disagree with the way you're going about it. And again, keeping your distance, keeping yourself and everyone else safe as you say something like that. Or it even could be, dare I say, a bit more generic, like, we're all Americans. We all want strong borders, but this is not how we do it. We do not terrorize communities that are thousands of miles away from the US border. You know, something like that to show that there's some amount of empathy for the mission, but not a lot of empathy for the way they are going about it right now. So I think that is something that, odd as it may sound to many Democrats and liberals such as myself, it is worth saying because, again, the goal in all this advice is to de-escalate the situation so that hopefully no one gets hurt. All right. And one more thing, just on a similar note to that, remember, as much as we dislike what is going on with ICE, some of the people who signed up for it are Americans. So that identity as Americans, dare I say, can even be used as a way to help de-escalate this situation. So again, you can step back, keep a safe distance, and say something along the lines of, hey, I'm an American too. I know you love this country. We both love this country, but what ICE is doing is wrong. I think that we should try something else. Maybe don't phrase it exactly like that, but hopefully you get the point of trying to call to some sense of common identity to maybe even start a conversation or just to de-escalate those tensions. Those are things I think we should do, again, to help keep everyone safe. So there is that. I also want to go through, I'm not going to share my screen because it's kind of hard to see through the camera, but Congressman Ocasio-Cortez has put out a good resource, both mainly for immigrants, but also, frankly, for everyday people in the U.S. to know their rights when they face ICE. So if you're in Charlotte and ICE shows up at your door, or if you're just minding your own business and God forbid something happens with ICE in the city of Charlotte, your rights as a citizen or immigrant both are, you do not have to open the door. They do not have the right to just enter a home. ICE doesn't have the right to enter a home without a warrant. You are more than capable of asking them to leave. You can stay silent and use your Fifth Amendment right to stay silent. You do not have to share personal information with ICE. You also have the right to speak with an attorney. And if possible, if you're going to go protest ICE or speak out against some of those sort of things in public, then if possible, if you can get in touch with an attorney, I am not a lawyer or a legal expert, but it is worth keeping that in mind just in case something does happen. And frankly, if people are watching this video and they have more thoughts on how people can do that, then please share that in the comments below. But again, you have the right to speak with an attorney. Make sure you remember that. You do not have to sign or hand over any documents to ICE. And at the very end of this document, she just talks about, make a plan, be prepared, make sure you have copies at your house or otherwise of important documents if you need them. Again, consult a lawyer if possible. Make a family plan. Again, identify emergency contact or caretaker. Make sure that someone, like I said earlier, knows where you are. Make sure you memorize at least one emergency phone number. And also know who your elected officials are, because they're another person that can be reached out to and can help advocate for you if ICE, God forbid, does detain you or does do something illegal. So going back to what I mentioned earlier about Alma Adams and even to an extent Attorney General Jeff Jackson, this is something where our elected officials can really help with is, if they get contacted about how someone's been wrongfully detained, then those elected officials have the resources to stand up for their citizens. And that is worth keeping in mind. All right, so that pretty much summarizes the things that we need to talk about right now to help keep people safe during this hard time. And that obviously covered my thoughts on what the response in North Carolina has been thus far. I want to pivot a little bit to what my thoughts are on what should happen to ICE in the future once Democrats, frankly, have the votes either after the midterms or certainly looking to 2028 and beyond, if we're able to, take back both the House and Senate, but also hopefully with a new president in office, because certainly a lot is going to need to be done once this is over. So you can also find these key stances of mine on my platform. Again, do we need to take border security seriously? Yes. Is there a real conversation to be had about how to do that? Yes. But ICE is acting as an enforcement arm for Donald Trump, and that is not good for anyone. That's not how we deal with illegal immigration. ICE needs to be disbanded and replaced with a new community immigration office, one that focuses on building relationships with immigrants and other communities to really actually do the right detective and community work to figure out who is trying to, find a viable pathway to citizenship in this country and play by the rules, or who is not. All right. And I think we need to start a government task force to bring stakeholders together at all levels to hold ICE accountable once this is all over. All right. So like I just mentioned, looking towards 2028 or beyond, I know that feels like a long time from now, and it kind of is. But once we have the ability to stop ICE for good, not only does it need to be disbanded, but there needs to be a federal investigation into the atrocities that they have already committed across the country and that they are probably trying to commit right now in the city of Charlotte. I would love to be a part of that investigation if I get a chance to get elected to Congress, and I encourage other members of Congress to do the same. And then quite simply, we need to design a new and improved and way easier pathway to citizenship. I mean, even from just the most practical point of view, if we want to really determine who is actually here legally versus illegally, well, if we make the pathway to citizenship easier, that goes a long way to doing it just that. All right. We are a nation of immigrants. We should support the ability of immigrants to come to our country and, build a meaningful life that contributes to our economy, our workforce, our own way of life. Of course, provided that they play by the rules, which almost all of them do, to the best of their abilities. But we have not made it easy for immigrants to get pathways to citizenship in this country, It is time to change that. All right. So those are my initial thoughts on long term what should be done about immigration and ICE in the future. The last thing I want to touch on, and this really ties into the point I had about the investigation, but I also want to call this to the attention of Attorney General Jeff Jackson, where I think we need to just start asking more questions about how ICE operates. We've all seen the videos, we've all seen the terrible atrocities they've committed, but I do think it's worth delving a bit deeper into how has ICE been able to just get to this point so easily and so unabated. Like I mentioned, we did not see much resistance from local law enforcement in a city like Chicago. Why? We keep seeing videos. I've even seen some of these videos, ironically, where ICE is trying to recruit people, ironically, with things like high pay, stable jobs, things like that. It's not like we couldn't just provide that to our educators, because that's absolutely what we should do. But again, I mentioned that because ICE is basically exploiting benefits that people want across our entire economy. So maybe that in and of itself suggests that, people want to find a stable, meaningful sort of life. And that, I know that may sound like some empathy there, but is there a way, in other words, to acknowledge that, people want to do something about immigration, but can we also make sure that they don't do the atrocities that ICE is doing? I don't know if I phrased that well, but anyway, that's one question. Where is ICE getting its intelligence from? They obviously use tips. They obviously work with local law enforcement, but how, at the end of the day, is ICE really, picking one building to raid over another? What's going into their decision making and their intelligence network to, roam around these different cities and wreak havoc? That question is really important because it's better to understand how these raids work and how ICE operates to help keep people safe. So those are just a couple questions on my mind. I do have several others, but I think what I am going to do is basically do a separate video about, what the right questions to ask about how ISIS operate, or just what the questions need to be about how ICE is operating. I hope that made sense. But yeah, okay. So in short, please stay safe. If you're going to go protest, if you're going to speak out against the things that are happening in the city of Charlotte, my heart is out to the city of Charlotte. I lived there for about a year and a half when I first moved to the state of North Carolina. I used to be a student at UNC Charlotte, then I transferred to NC State. So it's really disheartening to see this happening in the city of Charlotte because the city does not deserve this. The whole country does not deserve this. And ICE is acting like a bully that's running around unchecked. They need to be held accountable. We need to focus on de-escalation to make sure that no one gets hurt and that we can prevent anything from getting worse. All right. I think that's going to do it for this video. Again, if you have a question, feel free to leave that in the comment section. But also, again, just please, guys, stay safe. All right. Follow some of the tips I mentioned. Make sure someone knows where you are at all times. Make sure you know your rights. Get in touch with a lawyer if you can, and get in touch with your elected officials because they have the power to do something about this. All right. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.